Welcome to the Answers for Elders radio show. Meet the trusted experts who will give you straight answers and will help guide you on the path of later life care. Now, here's your host, founder, caregiver, and CEO, Suzanne Newman.
And welcome everyone to the Answers for Elders radio network. And it's a great time at this time to start out fall right. And we're in the autumn season where we're have the leaves turning and the changing and the loss of the foliage from the summer, and our everything kind of diminishes. And it's so interesting because the diminishment, there's a great metaphor, I think, for our next guest, because we have a guest that is nationally renowned, including appearances with Oprah Winfrey and Maria Shriver. She's an Alzheimer's and dementia expert, and my friend that I have known for a very, very long time, Ms. Lori LeBay from Alzheimer's Speaks. And welcome to the show, Lori.
Well, Suzanne, I'm so excited to be here with you. So thanks for having me on today.
I'm excited because, I talked about the leaves on the trees diminishing. And a lot of times I think about that's kind of what happens with the brain on Alzheimer's. And we watch as things fade away with our loved ones. And for those of you that are listening, we're in the Pacific Northwest. I am, and Lori is coming to us from Minneapolis. But one of the things that I am aware of in the state of Washington, we have one of the most highest per capita of residents in the state of Washington that are suffering from Alzheimer's disease. We don't know necessarily why that is. I don't know. But it's certainly interesting. It's an interesting statistic and one that we really pay attention to in Answers for Elders. And of course, I remember when I first got into the industry, this is in the early days of Answers for Elders. I reached out to Lori primarily, not only because I thought she was amazing and I started listening, believe it or not, to when she started doing podcasts, which is way before me. And Lori, you were such a great help to me in understanding a lot of how I view Alzheimer's disease. And, you and I both have a similar story. You lived with your mom that started in with dementia and going through. And so you had a firsthand experience of being a quote unquote family caregiver, just like I did.
Yeah. My mom lived with the disease for 30 years.
That is amazing. That is amazing. It's just almost unheard of. So tell us a little bit about your background before we get into Alzheimer's Speaks, which you are incredible. And we're going to go into and talk to everyone about all the resources that are available to you. And if you know of anyone, you're listening to this podcast and you think, I know, someone that has a loved one with Alzheimer's, I hope that you will direct them to this podcast, because this lady is really one of our most amazing ones out there in the industry. She's definitely the cream of the crop and knows her stuff. So tell us a little bit, Lori, first about your background with your mom. I know 30 years, that's a long time.
Yeah. So, my mom had a doctor of 40 years who knew nothing about dementia, but back then nobody talked about it, so she's been gone since 2014. So the first 10 years, she kept being told from her doctor that it was menopause. And my mom would say, "This ain't my girlfriend's menopause. We talk about the symptoms. They are definitely different."
Yeah.
And, and it just kept accelerating. She kept pulling back. So things like she told time by the TV. So if you would go over there, the guys would go over, they'd want to watch a football game. They want to change the channel. They couldn't, because mom would have to have it on channel 4, because she knew by the anchors in the news what time of day it was. And we didn't realize that's what that was all about. But she couldn't read a clock anymore. She didn't, if the phone rang, she wasn't quite sure what it was. She couldn't really use the appliances. She started withdrawal. She was really social. So there were a lot of changes that took place, during that time. Sure. Biggest thing was, I think, the frustration of getting a diagnosis. And then even once we did, and we had to claw tooth and nail, get this back then, they sent it to us in the mail. She's got the mentality of a 3-year-old. Don't let her out of your sight. And we're like, really? That's it? But that's how it was done, back then. And so,
and this is what year?
Oh gosh, this would have been in the 80s then.
Yeah.
When she finally got a diagnosis, and because it started in the 70s. And it was so frustrating. You felt alone. Nobody really talked about it. Nobody knew what Alzheimer's was. The word dementia wasn't even discussed. People were still talking about people being senile and demented.
Yeah.
And I could relate to that because when I was 13, my great aunt, who I adored, was in a nursing home. And I'll never forget the day she didn't remember who I was. I was devastated. Yeah. And I cried for like 2 weeks thinking, how can she not know me? How could she remember my brother, who could care less if about her at all? My mom was
Isn't that weird?
And I really enjoyed her company, and we were really close. And I thought I did something wrong. And I remember my mom telling me back then, it's just, when we get old, this is what happens. And so there weren't answers, and there weren't answers with her. But I learned to engage with her. I learned to advocate for her. I learned to, just speak up and say, there's got to be others like our family.
Sure.
And yet my dad and I were really the only two. My two brothers weren't very involved, which is probably what a lot of your audience experiences. Families aren't all on the same page.
They are not, definitely.
Yeah. So for my brothers, I think it was the emotional part of it. They didn't want to have to deal with that. If they saw my mom declining, then there's emotions, and they didn't want to have to process those. So, it was tough. I was I was married. I have a daughter. She's only known her grandma with dementia her whole life. And when she was like, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years old, she was coloring with grandma, and I walked in the door, and they both held up their pictures, and you couldn't tell who was prouder. I mean, and it melted my heart though, because they were just, there's those joyful moments, and instead of poo-pooing them and go, oh, why is grandma doing that? Appreciating that grandma is doing that.
Yeah.
And that your child is benefiting from that.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you were insightful enough, where a lot of people are not, to enter grandma where she was, in other words, to acknowledge that this is where she's at, and to meet them in that moment. And I think that's really where, I find a lot of families, they'll want to correct their loved one, or they'll want to tell mom that isn't how it is. Or anything like that. And I remember having a mentor when I was taking care of my mom, although my mom had vascular dementia, but it's similar. And I would correct her because I was trying so hard to be a good caregiver, and I wanted to make sure they had all the facts straight. And I remember just thinking, it would be terrible if they believed that she said something and it wasn't true, because it goes against my wiring, but the nurse of the facility where she was living at the time, at the skilled nursing center, she said to me, she goes, Suzanne, let me tell you something. The truth is pretty much irrelevant at this point in her life. And I just kind of went, wow, that's really good. And I learned then there was a way that I could still communicate to doctors in a different way without demeaning her or correcting her, because that just caused a division. And I think that's part of what you did right from day one, is you met her where she was.
Well, I wouldn't say from day one. I went through those headbanging times too. But I learned fairly quickly that, perception is reality.
Right.
Online for all of us, dementia or not, our history, our thoughts, our beliefs become our reality. And it's just with somebody with dementia, you can't logic with them. And for me, it got to a point of, like, there was a point when my dad passed. We could keep reliving that with her and going, no, dad's gone, and have her cry and just go through this grieving process. Or we can say, what's more important than time and our reality? But is she safe? Is she happy? Is she pain-free?
Sure.
And who would want a loved one, or really anyone, to have to keep reliving a moment like that?
Exactly.
And so, there's ways around that. And people go, well, I'm not going to lie. And it's like, I call it a fiblet, where you kind of
fiblets.
A fiblet.
I love that.
Where you kind of form the truth to fit the moment. And so, dad just went out with his friends for a little while, and he's in heaven with his friends for a while.
Yeah.
She will see him eventually.
Yeah.
But I had to frame it different in my head because I didn't want her going through the grief. And that she could understand, that she could process. And there's a saying, you're never going to win an argument with a person with dementia.
Exactly.
So stop trying, because then you're just going to elevate your grief too through that process.
Well, and also, even though, if you have a parent, obviously I had a difficult childhood with my mother. I mean, my mom and I were never close, but what I learned is that there was all kinds of punishment to deal with if I contradicted anything she had to say. And even though I was right, of remembering facts or things like that, it didn't help the fact that it wasn't it wasn't a positive outcome between her and I. And I just learned eventually, like you said, I love your little phrase called a fiblet. It truly is. It's the greater good. It's the fact that understanding that their reality is not necessarily our reality.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Lori, we're going to be together. I'm so excited to our listeners. We're going to be together this hour. And so we're going to have 3 more segments together, but I want all of our listeners, before we go to segment 2, how do we reach you?
Real easy. Just go to alzheimerspeaks.com, and there we have one whole page that has free educational resources, big wide variety. We'll talk about that more a little bit later, but just go to alzheimerspeaks.com.
We're very excited. And again, Lori LeBay from alzheimerspeaks.com is with us this hour. We're so excited, and we'll be right back right after this. We at Answers for Elders thank you for listening. Did you know that you can discover hundreds of podcasts in our library on senior care? So visit our website and discover our decision guides that will help you also navigate decision making. Find us at answersforelders.com.